It is just crazy to me how pervasive complex PTSD is, and especially how pervasive it is in so many of our childhoods. That the idea that we can experience trauma at the hands of caregivers has taken this long to really talk about. It just sort of blows my mind. And so I wanted to go back and remake and add a few things to a video I made, I think it was a couple years ago when I first started here on YouTube. And that one was titled 12 Signs You May Have Cptsd. And so please go check that out if you want to sort of continue to dive deeper in this topic. But I'm hoping that today's video really gives you signs that really support all the things that you know were true, and maybe puts them all in one collection of spaces and symptoms that you can honor for yourself and hopefully potentially direct healing if you are in need. So we're going to go through 15 signs of childhood Cptsd, complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And just a quick reminder that the complex part is really referring to the complex nature of repetitive, often relational trauma. And so you can have Cptsd not from your childhood. It can come from all kinds of situations. It can come from narcissistic relationships. It can come from different forms of trauma that can happen in our lives. And so that's important to acknowledge. But I really want to go into what it looks like and how it plays out in our symptoms, especially if it occurred in childhood. Now, I want to say really quickly that, and you've probably heard me say it before, I do not believe that kids are as resilient as we want to say they are. I think that we tell ourselves that to feel better historically, and honestly, we do it because kids may or may not show symptoms. And because of the way we've approached parenting in so many places across the world, we don't necessarily see children as their own separate entities. We often see them as, this attempt we have to shape little mini adults, and we presume all kinds of things. And there's not a safe place for a child to express their symptomatology in many cases. And as I've said, and you know in so many videos, that children don't have anywhere to go. In fact, I'm going to talk about this in my next video, about the relationship between chronic kind of Cptsd symptoms and feeling trapped in childhood and helpless and powerless, and how that can play out in us being overdoers, hyper fixers, and things like that. But let's get into 15 signs that you may have childhood Cptsd. The first sign, no surprise here, is that you live in a state of hypervigilance. And what does that really mean? At the core, it's about a kind of fight or flight response where you are in a mobilized state. Remember, going back to polyvagal theory with the idea of the nervous system existing on a ladder. At the top, we have what's called ventral vagal, and that's the place of connection, of feeling emotionally regulated, sort of not needing to do anything or collapsed. You are in a state of being available and present and open. The next level down on the ladder is where we find fight, flight, and really freeze in that regard. And that fight, flight, and freeze technically are places where we need to mobilize. We need to do something. And then below that is what we call, and that's actually the sympathetic, right? That's the sympathetic nervous system. And the parasympathetic, the dorsal vagal, is really about a shutdown. And this is often where we find collapse and submit as part of the trauma responses. So we have fight, flight, freeze, fawn, which is technically more of an adaptability survival response, not necessarily as automatic and reflexive as we think about fight, flight, and freeze. So we have fight, flight, freeze, fawn. Attach, cry out for help, which is sort of a desperate need to attempt to connect, really feeling that desperateness inside. And then we have collapse and submit, which is really where we go into shutdown. Now, the idea about freeze, for example, being in that sort of mobilizing state is that, let's say I'm, out in the savannah somewhere and I suddenly see a lion, tiger, or bear, not really a bear, but you know what I mean, approaching me. I can fight, I can flee, Or I may want to freeze. That's a decision I might need to make in the moment. But when we start to talk about full-on collapsing and not being able to move and a full shutdown, that can often fall in that more collapsed dorsal vagal area. So the idea is that freeze has a purpose, but freeze can also kind of fall, I think, too, in that, when you think about it, in that shutdown state. But the idea is mobilization is the concept around the sympathetic response, and immobilization, unable to mobilize, is about the dorsal vagal response. So when we think about childhood, we think about our attachment system at birth, our parents' attachment system, I should say, meeting as our baby selves, our parents' attachment system, and their sort of go-to nervous system responses. Meaning that maybe your parent operates in a lot of more fight or flight. They're very anxious, they're hypervigilant, or they might be a parent who's very shut down, very more in a depressive kind of vibe, or has a hard time, moving up the ladder. And so we're going to learn that with this particular parent or set of parents or caregivers, we have to do and say some things to survive. And we have no choice. It is only about survival. We cannot survive without them. Newborns cannot survive. Kids can't survive without parents up until a certain point. So we have to be good at reading them. And this is where hypervigilance comes in. This is where if you had a parent, let's say, who was themselves struggling with hypervigilance, anxiety, who lived in their go-to was fight or flight. What we're talking about, and this could also include neglect, right? Whatever it is, but the point is that I talk a lot about eggshell parents, because if you had eggshell parents who raged, who yelled, who were loving, who were conditional, who were safe, who were unsafe, you have to live in a state where you're never truly safe. And so you are scanning. What does this behavior mean? What does this response mean? Do I need to read their nonverbals? Things like there's the sigh. Does that begin to mean that if that parent sighs like that at the end of a long day, a rage might follow? For some families, it might. The sigh might mean that whatever little bit of neglect you were having, it was going to be more neglect, meaning that they were more exhausted and they weren't going to meet your needs. But hypervigilance is about scanning and self-protecting and really just spending all your time trying to figure out what to do in response to this parent or caregiver to get your needs met. And that is very common in those of us who have complex PTSD on any level, but especially thinking about your wiring as a child. If you arrived in the world needing to scan and you spent the majority of your childhood scanning for whatever reason, even if you were removed from the home and now you're in a different home, now you have to learn to read all of that parents' or caregivers' signals. Even if they were safer, your nervous system has been wired. So hypervigilance, I think, is really underrated in terms of the chronic nature, especially around Cptsd. So we're scanning, and we are then making adjustments and modifications and adaptations about our lives. So you live in a scanning state, and you can't just turn that off after an entire, environment of your childhood where that was a vital survival skill. Number two, often we can, in response to that, be isolators. And this is, of course, I'm talking about how this plays out in our adult lives. And so maybe we found that human beings are really stressful and we live in a state of hypervigilance. And the only time we don't have to pay attention to all the humans, whether it's our kids, our boss, our partner, is when we are alone. And so isolating can be a very common response to a more complex PTSD around childhood. And a lot of the time I believe it is really not so much, well, it can be about, obviously humans aren't safe because we can't trust them, because they'll leave us, because they're hurtful. But it can also be because we're trying to regulate our bodies. And in fact, we might not be in a more ventral vagal connected state. We're more in a shutdown state because we spend so much time in that sympathetic place that when we are able to get our bodies down, we spend a lot of time alone in that way to regulate. Number three, we often repeat the cycles and patterns and relational dynamics of childhood. So we grow up and we inadvertently, unconsciously choose partners who, even if they look completely different, they bring up the same set of feelings from childhood. Not feeling worthy, receiving conditional love, having to scan and be hypervigilant, believing that love must be earned, things like that. And so we end up, oftentimes in an attempt to heal, finding ourselves in repetitive patterns that are really, at the end of the day, no matter how you slice them, they are not safe consistently, mostly, because no one is, I think, perfectly safe all the time. Safe meaning, you're not going to get mad at me, not safe meaning in the literal dynamic. But at the bottom line of this is that we repeat unhealthy patterns and we end up feeling a lot of the same feelings that we're longing to heal from childhood. Number 4, chronic health issues. We know that the research shows there's a very strong relationship between what happens to us in childhood and chronic illness and issues in our adult lives. And if you don't believe me, go research the ACEs study. The ACEs is basically a set of experiences that we know, meaning that adverse childhood experiences, adverse being the key, things like divorce and parents fighting and illness and loss and mental health issues, the neighborhood you grow up in, the culture, the lack of safety that might exist around those things as a result of socioeconomic status. There's so many things that can impact us, but we know that having some difficulty with our bodies, our chronic health, is extremely common for those of us who have some form of complex trauma. Number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, chronic mental health issues, anxiety, depression, difficulty regulating ourselves, all kinds of dynamics can be eating disorders. So many things can be related to the mental and physical health. And remember, there is no separate thing. Your brain is not some separate thing from your body. It is all connected and flowing, and we know this. And so that's why it's such a tragedy that we've decided that Western medicine says these are your body issues and these are your brain issues. They are all connected. And for example, one of the things I talk to a lot of patients about is sleep. I really believe, and the research shows, that there's a significant relationship between your sleep and your mental health. And let's say you have generalized anxiety, so you don't sleep well. Let's say you have hormone issues, so you don't sleep well. Let's say you live in a state of, chronic hypervigilance in childhood. When it got quiet, it wasn't safe in your home. And so even when it's quiet at night, you get worried. Or let's say that you stay up really, really late at night because that is the only time you feel regulated and peaceful and calm in your home, even though you have a safe home now. And that sabotages sleep. So we know things like, chronic things like cancer, diabetes, autoimmune illness, traumatic brain injury, maternal mental health and physical health, risk of early pregnancy. All of these can be related to the adverse experiences of childhood and play out in our mental and physical health. The next one is, it's very common for us to struggle with some different forms of dissociation, from spacing out to having a difficult time being in the present, going into that. There are varying degrees of forms of maladaptive daydreaming and fantasies where you create entire other worlds. It can be actually quite severe. Everything from just highway hypnosis and driving home, which is fairly common and doesn't mean you have trauma, unless, of course, it goes with all these symptoms. And then it can also relate to your ability to be present and focused around attention and awareness and things like that. Concentration even. So how your brain is in the present or not can be significant. And it makes sense when you think about, oftentimes dissociation is a way for us to survive what feels unsurvivable, or to escape from feelings, or to manage, whatever's going on in our lives. Fantasy, it can be, it can be a tool. It's just that it can become our primary way of operating. And certainly in the extreme form, in terms of dissociative disorders, it can definitely be a response to severe trauma. Things like depersonalization, where you don't feel like you're, in your body. Derealization, where you don't feel like things are real, like you're hovering over yourself, or things are surreal. So all of that can be ways we respond to dealing with our trauma in childhood. The next one is having a harsh inner critic and struggling with perfectionism, busyness, workaholism. The idea behind the concept that we find in Pete Walker's book on Cptsd, Surviving to Thriving, is that the perfectionist occurs to us in this way. In childhood, we think, well, if I'm perfect, then I won't have to be at fault and unlovable and to blame for all these bad things. So we develop this inner and outer critic to kind of scan all of the time. Uh-oh, you're not doing that right. You're not good enough. You're going to fail. What's wrong with you? Things like that. And so that can truly play out in us never being good enough. And of course, I do believe that the core of so much of this entire experience of childhood Cptsd is the belief that deep inside we are unworthy and unlovable. And that goes into the next one, which is really toxic shame. And toxic shame really is about that idea that there's something deeply wrong with us. It's not that we didn't make a good choice, it's that we aren't a good choice to be even existing in some form. And so that deep belief of unlovability is pervasive in our lives, even though we might look different on the outside, like we have it all figured out and we're confident, things like that. Deep inside, we often go to when things don't go well, if we're not good enough, if we're afraid or embarrassed, it goes back to it being something wrong with us or that we're in trouble, that we'll make mistakes and things like that. And that goes back to scanning, as I was talking about hypervigilance. The next one is living in survival mode. And this is the thing where, yes, it's related to anxiety and hypervigilance, but it just always feels like no matter what is happening in your life, it's a matter of survival every day. I made a TikTok last week about this. Like I wake up on a Monday and there's this just feeling inside like my entire rest of my retirement and my life and my day and my financial life all depends on that day, which is ridiculous. And how you know that you're still in survival mode is if you are no longer literally in it. Like it isn't a matter of day-to-day survival, but you feel like it. So yes, you have, you know where the next meal's coming from. You have a good, safe place to sleep. You're not in an unsafe relationship. But that panic inside, it's like your brain gets transported back to childhood, where you are just treading water trying to survive. But really, if we looked at your life, while it might be stressful, you aren't just treading water. There are places to swim and survive, but it feels like at any moment, you're going to go under. The next one is feeling just generally unworthy. And I was saying that in the last few, but it's one of those things where your success, your appearance, whatever it is, there's like boxes always checked about how it's not good enough and it will never be good enough. So it's like you arrive in every situation with suitcases, they're really heavy, and they are basically saying, no matter what you do, you'll always have to carry these suitcases. You'll never be enough. And you spend a lot of time and effort and energy trying to combat that. It could be through the way you try to control your body, your eating, your relationships, whatever it is. But no matter what, there's that little part inside that says, everyone else in the room is good enough, but you never will be. The next one is emotional flashbacks. And I can't stress this enough, how common this is for those of us. And what I want you to really get about this one is that what often happens is something triggers us, whether we're aware of it or not. And it's just a feeling we have. And it feels like a storm. When I've talked about sort of, something happening around my last relationship, divorce, which was years ago, there can be something that happens with people in the game and the players that involve that situation. I'm going to try to keep this general. And they can say or do something that for whatever reason can trigger a deep-seated fear, a feeling where for several days, it doesn't happen very often, but it can happen. It happens less often now, I would say, I'm speaking for myself, than it used to. But it can still happen where I just feel in this dark cloud of like exhausted and everything is wrong and it's never going to work, or it's a fear or a shame-based place or an anxious place. And this is really common for people when you're having some kind of trigger with your family, where your family meaning in childhood, and something in your adult life happens, and it's like you're back in that little body, that little child self. You're that little kid in the room trying to avoid the parents fighting, or the kid who's standing in the kitchen home alone at 7, 8 years old wondering when your parents coming home. Things like that. And so the way you know it, it's like sometimes you can say, oh yeah, this happened and I feel this way. But sometimes it's just like you just feel like, am I suddenly massively depressed? Or am I more anxious than usual or terrified or scared? And you may be. But if you don't normally have that dynamic, especially with something like depression, and you suddenly feel really down, it can be potentially a flashback, which may lift. And what often happens is it lifts. So really it's like someone took you out of your adult body and transported you, like you regress back to feeling states in childhood. That's how it happens. The next one is being hyper and excessively controlling. And this is the idea that you had zero control in childhood, and so now you're always trying to control everything. It might play out in how you parent, that now all of a sudden, I think this has actually been a really bad collision of the parenting world changing in a good way, but how it can meet childhood trauma, where it's like, for example, let's say in childhood, I had absent parents, I was alone a lot, I grew up on frozen food. That's all true actually for me. But now I could be the kind of mom, and I had these issues when my kids were little, and I still do, but they're way better, but I can really see them now, where I had this fantasy and illusion of control that everything was going to be different. I was going to make every meal from scratch. I saw moms, as my kids got older and the millennial moms, they were going to make all their baby food, there's nothing wrong with that. But they were going to do, I used to laugh, like essential oils and baby food and crafts and no devices. And I mean, at some point, like that's fine, but it takes a lot to keep that going every day. And you cut yourself zero slack, right? If you gave your kids the cell phone, now you've failed at parenting, as opposed to saying, yeah, I need a break today and I am at my limit. And rather than yelling at them, I'm going to give them the iPad. This is very different from raising your kids on an iPad or whatever you're doing, and even there's no judgment. Parenting is the hardest job on the planet, but there's a very big spectrum between neglecting raising your child and not being present, and at times along the way needing to access different ways to survive parenting, right? So, but the control can play out in that you had this vision of childhood that you had, and it's all going to be different, and the control part sets you up to, number one, be chronically exhausted. Number two, to feel like a chronic failure, because there is no way you can maintain that unless you have nannies and a supportive partner and a house cleaner. And even if you did, it's like we set this standard that is so high, and it can be really devastating for us and impactful to our own mental and physical health if we're trying to control. But the control desire is coming from a good place. It's a way to try to say that's not my childhood, and I'm going to do my adult life differently. It's just that it can cause a lot of damage. And lastly, difficulty ever trusting or feeling safe. So that at the core, the violation of safety is the biggest dynamic with childhood Cptsd. So that no matter what happens, you never feel that you can trust people. They will leave you, they'll abandon you, they're not who they say they are, and you kind of show up like with those suitcases. No matter how you show up in a way that you pretend or mask to be that it's going to be fine and we're all going to be safe, it's all going to work out. Deep inside, you don't trust people. So you don't let them in, or you guard parts of yourself, which you may need to do. But the issue is that deep inside, you have a distrust because, as I've been saying so much lately, humans are the trigger. Humans are not safe. Relating is not safe. And if you think about if that's a core belief alongside being unlovable and, let's say, hypervigilance, well, think about how easy it would be to live in a state of wanting to isolate, because you're not wanting to do that, I should say. I don't even want to say it that way. It feels like a survival response to isolate, for example. And it may be. There's nothing wrong with that. Unless, of course, you wish you had more connection and people in your life. I think we have shamed people for being alone way too much. And there's a line, though, between, connection and all of that is healing, and a line between honoring each of our own stories and our own nervous systems. And so I know there are more than these, there truly are, but when I think about how chronic Cptsd symptoms play out, especially for those of us who had the childhood experience, this is what it looks like. And unfortunately, because of our trauma in childhood, we can often find ourselves in traumatic adult life relationships that repeat the story, like I said, whether it's your boss, your partner, whatever. So, for example, as I've talked about, let's say you had all this in your childhood, and then you unconsciously choose an unsafe partner, and you have kids, and then you end up divorcing a narcissist, an emotionally unsafe person. Now you are reenacting all of that trauma in your adult body, dragging your kids with you, trying to deal with that. And of course, there's a big difference between a somewhat, normal divorce and a divorcing a narcissist. But many of us who have these childhoods are more likely to choose narcissistic partners, for example, unsafe partners. And so that's why I think sometimes I get really triggered. I just saw a post about Gwyneth Paltrow talking about how she contributed to this growing dynamic of conscious uncoupling. And I thought, well, that the part where we could say you could be friends with your ex and co-parent together is a beautiful idea, as long as you're not divorcing a narcissist. And I think this is where we feel so shamed, re-shamed and isolated. If we've repeated our complex trauma unconsciously, it's really difficult. It sounds great. Sit on your high horse and tell everyone how it doesn't serve your kids, and it doesn't. I am not saying that you shouldn't try to find ways to deal with it, to reduce conflict, to put your kids at the center, but that is really difficult if you are now living in the trauma of an adult relationship. And it is very different from divorcing somebody who has flaws, has issues, but at the heart isn't imposing repeated or even different or more toxic trauma on you. And so if that's you, I just want you to know that you're not alone, and to give yourself as much compassion and grace as you can. I'm not suggesting that getting help isn't a good idea. I think having a therapist helped me through some of the last years. I wish she'd been around earlier, in those earlier years of narcissistic abuse and trauma in a divorce. It would have been incredibly helpful. But there's also a part of this where there's almost no way around it. And oftentimes it's really difficult if you arrived in that relationship already having a difficult childhood. And so anyway, the point is that it's not just that, oh, that was just in your childhood. For so many of us, because of these wounds, these difficulties, our own inability, hi Coco, to manage, we find ourselves stuck in more traumatic adult relationships that actually become adult Cptsd as a result of the adult relationship, like a narcissistic relationship or abuse. So that's it. Do you want to see Coco really quick? Let me grab her. Hold on. I know I haven't had her on here for a few weeks. Hold on one second. Are you trying to go in this room? You are? Come here, baby. Your friends want to see you. Come here. Whoa. Come here. Here she is. Okay. Okay. You say hi, Coco. Say hi. Okay. Coco says hi. Have a beautiful day. Please stay safe and well, and I will see you tomorrow. Take care. Bye. You say bye? Okay, say bye.